Hi, my name is Madison Castleberry. The topic that I'm going to be going over is competence to refuse an insanity defense and any other mental state defenses. So, for the video that I chose for my media, is one of what does it mean to be criminally insane. I feel like in order to really understand the process and just having the knowledge of why someone would refuse an insanity defense or any other state defenses for their mental health, really you should understand the insanity plea in general. So this is a really great video that breaks it down. So
Pleading.
some of the details that it goes over is the definition of being criminally insane, who can plead it, what are the requirements, is it different per state, who determines if the defendant is criminally insane, how common is the insanity plea and its success rate in court. Like I said earlier, by learning about mental state defenses, understanding the refusal on the insanity plea and its processes is a bit easier. So the criteria to plead insanity, there are 3 different tests. There's the Manhattan Rule, there's the American Law Institute model, which is also known as the Bronner Rule, and lastly, the Durham test. So the Manhattan Rule, the 2 criteria for it is that you have to prove that the mental illness affects the offender's understanding of the crime that they were committing, and then also that it affects the offender's understanding of the crime that they committed was illegal. So Arizona no longer requires the offender to not understand their crimes. Um, and then 21 states still use this test to this day. The Bronner Rule or the American Law Institute model, the only criteria for that is that you have to prove that the mental illness affects the offender's acknowledgement of the crime in their actions. You cannot plead insanity through Bronner Rule more than once for the same crime. So if there were someone who committed the crime first and then pleaded that way, they cannot do it a second time, as long as it is the same crime. And 20 states to this day still uses this test. And then lastly is the Durham test. So mental illness took part in the offender's criminal acts is the only criteria to it. However, New Hampshire is the only state to still use this as their insanity test. So the competent to refuse an insanity defense, a person can deny the insanity plea if it is voluntary and they are in the right mind to make the demand. And the court's definition of this is that they must be able to make fundamental decisions about the course of the proceedings. So they have to be able to just fully understand the process of the court, and they really need to understand what they're putting themselves into. The court does make the final decision after considering evaluations from professionals. This is where you'll see a lot of forensic psychologists take part in the court system. Also, the Sixth Amendment right is extremely important on this part. The Sixth Amendment right can be violated for the defender if their defense team continues with the insanity plea when the defender does not want to go along with it. Like if they do not want to plead the insanity plea, but their defense team goes along with it, it will be violating their Sixth Amendment right. So a few reasons why someone might refuse an insanity defense is that they must plead guilty to the crime in order to plead insanity. So a lot of the times they may not want to admit to the crime in the first place. They don't want to plead guilty to it because they don't feel that they are guilty. So they will refuse an insanity defense for that. Also, their disbelief in their own mental illness. This can be seen quite often, but they refuse to admit or to understand that they do have a mental illness, and so they will not go along with the insanity defense. Lastly, is they'd rather spend time in prison than a mental hospital. So they don't want to spend time in a mental hospital, especially because they won't technically have a release date. A lot of times they'll be released whenever the doctors deem them safe to return back to society. without them being a potential harm to themselves or to others. Also, I feel like there's a lot of expectations that people have of mental hospitals just because of what a lot of people have talked about with it. Issues with finding competence to refuse. I feel like it is very controversial. Are they actually competent or is it their mental illness causing the refusal? I feel like this is where a lot of it's really important for professionals to step in and get a strong understanding of how their mind is working at the moment because a lot of times it could be their mental illness that is causing them to not accurately decide on how they want the court system to go with their crimes. Also, criminal competencies are not uniform for several reasons, such as each case being unique with each unique individual and each unique crime. And so with this one, why the mental illness is treated uniformly in court, although that their tests may be different and that the professionals are able to pick up on their specific mental illnesses, they're all still treated the same way in court, even though there's so many different types of mental illnesses out there. They're relying heavily on professionals, which can be really tricky. Are the professionals being influenced by anybody, or is there any underlying bias with the professionals? Although we would love for every professional to be professional and great at their job and not biased, unfortunately, we do have people still out there in that way. So I feel like this should be heavily focused on. Fortunately, our court system is not perfect and people have been wrongly convicted. Adding competence for mental illness only adds further difficulty for a fair trial. And there's my reference page. Thank you.